The dim light from the lamp only illuminates the notebook in my hands. It's 3 in the morning, and I can finally write. The words pour out like a late-night confession. I begin to trace on the paper. Have you ever felt such intense anger that you were scared of it? My fingers tremble slightly. The stillness of the house amplifies the sound of the pen sliding across the page. I've kept this story inside me for so long. The story of how I learned to listen to what everyone taught me to silence. I felt it, I write, and a tear forms in the corner of my eye. For years, I was taught to smile, to swallow my screams. The memories flash by, my mother whispering in my ear before family gatherings, "Remember to be polite, sweetie. Don't make any faces." My father applauding whenever I gave in. "See how everything goes smoother when you don't argue." To stay light even when the world felt like it weighed a ton. I feel it in my body again. The heaviness, the compression, the times I smiled while something inside me begged to scream. The times I said, "It's fine," while my whole body was saying no. But one day it came, not as an enemy, but as a guardian. I pause my writing for a moment and glance out the window. The night is deep out there. I feel grateful for the darkness. It's in the dark that we can finally see the stars. This is a Jungian bedtime story about the anger that saved me. I close the notebook. I'll continue tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll give a voice to everything I've kept silent for so long. I was 7 when I first understood the power of my smile. I was in the living room, playing with my dolls, when I heard my parents arguing in the kitchen. Their voices kept getting louder. My stomach knotted with that familiar anxiety. Then, with the intuition of a child who already knew her role in the family theater, I ran to them. "Look at this new dance I learned at school," I said, forcing the widest smile I could. I spun around clumsily, striking a pose at the end. The miracle happened instantly. My parents stopped arguing. My mom crouched down to hug me. My dad patted my hair. "Our little princess," he said, "always so happy." The tension in the air vanished, replaced by smiles and attention. With the clarity that only children have, I realized, my joy was a magical power that could save the grown-ups around me. That night, lying in bed, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Something had been left behind in the kitchen. Something I wasn't allowed to feel. But I was a good girl, and good girls don't think about such things. I closed my eyes and fell asleep, dreaming of applause. That lesson was reinforced over the years. In elementary school, when a classmate took my pencils without asking, the teacher said, "Be generous, dear, sharing is good." At home, when my older brother grabbed the last slice of cake I'd been waiting for, my mom said, "Let him have it. You're a dainty young lady. You don't need that much." In middle school, whenever I found my friends crying in the bathroom, I was the one who comforted them. "You're so balanced," they'd say. "You never lose your cool." That became my identity. The girl who never explodes, who always understands, the friend who's always available. And so, brick by brick, I built the perfect prison for myself. A prison made of compliments and expectations. A prison where I was the patron saint of infinite understanding. Teenage years arrived, and with them my first boyfriends. The pattern repeated. I was the girlfriend who understood when they cancelled plans at the last minute, who didn't mind when they disappeared, who didn't complain when she was left out. "You're different from the others," they'd say, as if that was the greatest compliment possible. "You're not dramatic." What they didn't know, what I myself didn't know yet, was that inside me, a volcano was slowly waking up. It was in college that the first symptoms appeared. Sleepless nights, constant jaw tension that my dentist noticed. "You grind your teeth at night," he said, prescribing a mouthguard. "Are you under a lot of stress?" I smiled, of course I smiled, and answered, "No, everything's fine." At work, the pattern repeated. I was the employee who stayed late, who accepted impossible projects, who never said no. My co-workers would say, "I don't know how you do it." Honestly, neither did I. The first panic attack happened on a perfectly normal Wednesday. I was at the grocery store picking apples when suddenly I couldn't breathe. Everything blurred at the edges and a buzzing sound filled my ears. Leaving my basket behind, I rushed to the parking lot and got in my car. Sitting there, hands shaking on the steering wheel, something strange happened. A voice inside me, a voice I'd never heard before, whispered, "You're exhausted from pretending." That night I went home and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror for a long time. Who was that woman with dark circles under her eyes and an automatic smile? When had I become a stranger to myself? I sank into the bathtub and, for the first time in years, let myself cry. Not a delicate, subdued cry, but a deep, raw sob that rose up from the depths of my being. I cried for every time I swallowed my no, for every time I smiled when I wanted to scream, for every time I put other people's needs above my own, until I forgot what my own needs even were. That night marked the beginning of my journey, not to become someone else, but to rediscover the person I had stifled for so very long. The body always knows. Long before our minds grasp the truth, our bodies are already screaming. I started paying attention to the signs in my own body, the way my stomach tightened when someone crossed my boundaries, the heat creeping up my neck when I said yes but really meant no, the headache that hit after long hours trying to please everyone around me. Observing myself more closely, I saw a pattern. Anytime I swallowed my anger, my body reacted, like it was desperately trying to get my attention. "Hey, something's off here, you're betraying yourself." My therapist was the first to label it. "Have you considered that your body might be expressing the anger your mind refuses to feel?" The word anger sounded so foreign. Good girls don't feel anger. Balanced women don't lose control. Mature people don't let themselves get carried away by negative emotions. "Anger isn't negative," she replied when I expressed those thoughts. "Anger is informative. It tells us when our boundaries have been crossed." Boundaries, another word that seemed like it came from a foreign language. What boundaries did I even have? For years, my identity revolved around being infinitely available. During that time, my physical symptoms got worse. Insomnia became my constant companion. I spent endless nights staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, envisioning scenarios where I finally said what I wanted to say. Muscle pains spread throughout my body, from my neck to my shoulders, from my shoulders to my back. It felt like my body was carrying some invisible burden. Maybe it was the burden of all those unspoken no's. Exhaustion was the hardest to explain to people. "But you don't do that much," they'd say, unaware that existing in a constant state of emotional alertness was draining, always ready to smooth things over, to mediate, to understand. That consumed an invisible kind of energy. It was the anger locked inside me that was taking root in my body. A silent anger that never came out in explosions or arguments, but through a daily inner struggle against myself. Around this time, I started having vivid dreams. In one recurring dream, I was in a burning house, but instead of running away, I politely offered tea to the flames that were consuming everything. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding. In another dream, I had an enormous mouth sewn shut with golden threads. The people around me applauded the beauty of the stitches, never noticing that I was suffocating. I brought these dreams to therapy. "Your unconscious is trying to communicate with you," my therapist said. What do you think it's trying to say? The answer didn't come in words, but in a visceral feeling. Something inside me was screaming to be heard. That's when I started learning about Jung's concept of the shadow, the idea that everything we repress, deny, or reject in ourselves doesn't vanish. It just moves into the unconscious, where it continues to affect our behaviors and emotions. My anger hadn't disappeared just because I wouldn't acknowledge it. It was there, growing in the darkness, getting wilder and more uncontrollable the more I denied it. One afternoon I was browsing the local bookstore when a book practically jumped off the shelf into my hands, Anatomy of the Spirit by Caroline Myss. Flipping through its pages, I found a passage that made me sit right down on the floor. When we deny our emotions, especially anger, we deny our own truth. This denial weakens our personal power and can eventually manifest as physical illness. Those words hit me like lightning. That's exactly what was happening to me. Every ache, every sleepless night, every unexplained exhaustion, these were physical manifestations of my neglected truth. I left the bookstore with the book and a new determination. It was time to listen to what my body had been trying to tell me for so long. I started keeping a log of bodily sensations. Whenever I felt tension, pain, or discomfort, I wrote down not just the physical sensation, but also the context around it. Who was I with? What was being said? What did I really want to say but didn't? Patterns began emerging. My neck tension flared during conversations with my mom. My back pain worsened after meetings with a co-worker who kept taking credit for my ideas. My insomnia was worse on days when I said yes to commitments I didn't actually want to make. My body was mapping out my violated boundaries, showing me exactly where and when I was abandoning myself. The question was, would I have the courage to listen? It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow awakening, page by page, line by line. The university library's psychology section became my sanctuary. Among those shelves, with the comforting smell of old books, I began my journey with Jung. That which you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate. That quote by Carl Jung jumped off the page like a personal prophecy. The idea that everything we repress doesn't just vanish but shapes our future without our awareness hit me like a revelation. I began to understand that my anger wasn't a flaw or a sign of immaturity. It was my psyche's message, trying to tell me that my boundaries were being crossed, my needs were unmet, parts of me were being sacrificed for the sake of outer harmony. Jung's shadow theory offered a new perspective. The shadow, that psychic storehouse of everything we repress or deny, was now clear to me. My anger had been shoved into the shadow since childhood, labeled inappropriate, ugly, dangerous. But as Jung taught, the more we deny our shadow, the more power it holds over us. It begins to show up in distorted ways, often against our conscious will. That explained my vivid nightmares, my mysterious physical symptoms, my attraction to people who repeatedly crossed my limits. My shadow was showing up in my life because I refused to consciously acknowledge it. One paragraph in Man and His Symbols felt like it was written just for me. The shadow is not necessarily evil. It is simply that which has not been chosen by consciousness, that which has been left aside. It contains qualities the ego needs but for some reason has repressed. Recognizing and integrating the shadow can therefore enlarge the conscious personality. Yes, my anger wasn't my enemy. It was a vital part of me that I had suppressed, a part that carried wisdom, strength, and a built-in self-defense mechanism. I went to a Jung exhibit at a local art museum, surrounded by mandalas, symbols, and artistic representations of the individuation process. I had a moment of clarity. One particular installation caught my attention, a fragmented mirror where each shard reflected a different piece of the viewer. I stood there looking at my divided reflection. In some fragments, I saw the obedient girl I'd always been. In others, I glimpsed something wilder, more authentic, a version of me I had never allowed to fully exist. A quote next to the installation read, "Individuation is the process of integrating the fragmented parts of the self into a more complete whole." That's when I truly understood. I didn't have to abandon my gentle, empathetic side to embrace my anger. The goal wasn't to swap one mask for another, but to integrate every facet of my being into a more authentic, whole personality. I went home that night and tried an exercise I'd read about in one of Jung's books. I sat in front of a mirror, looked into my own eyes and out loud asked, "What do you need me to know?" At first I felt silly, but I kept looking, breathing, waiting. Then something strange happened. Tears started rolling down my face, and an inner voice, not my usual voice, but something deeper, more primal, answered, "I'm tired of being silenced." It was like a dam broke. I cried for hours, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. For the first time in my adult life, I let myself fully feel the anger I'd repressed for decades. That night, I wrote in my journal, "My anger isn't madness, it's a signal, it's a shadow asking for light." And so began my real work, bringing my shadow into the light, not to control or tame it, but to integrate and honor it as a vital part of my whole self. In the beginning, it was terrifying. Letting my anger speak felt like opening a door to something uncontrollable. What if, once I let it in, it consumed me completely? What if I became what I'd always feared? Bitter, resentful, destructive. But the more I studied Jung and other depth psychologists, the clearer it became. The real threat wasn't the anger itself, but the repressed anger. Anger that doesn't find conscious expression doesn't vanish. It morphs, disguises itself, and eventually explodes in ways we can't control. I started by creating a safe space to hear my anger. Every morning before starting my day, I'd sit with my journal and ask, "What upset you yesterday? What hurt you? What crossed your boundaries?" At first, the answers were slow, hesitant, like a child testing if it's truly safe to speak. Over time, they grew clearer, more articulate. I was surprised to discover that my anger wasn't some irrational beast. It was eloquent, precise, and, most surprisingly, deeply wise. It didn't scream for revenge or destruction. It whispered, "This isn't right. You deserve better. You need to protect yourself." One of the most powerful exercises I found was writing letters I never intended to send, to people who had crossed my boundaries. In these letters, I allowed myself to express everything: the hurt, the frustration, raw anger without filters. I wrote with no self-censorship, letting the words flow as needed. After finishing each letter, I performed a small ritual. I'd read it out loud to myself, acknowledging and validating every emotion I'd put down. Then I'd burn the paper in a small ceramic bowl, watching the words turn to ash. This act wasn't about erasing anger. It was about transforming it. As I watched the smoke rise, I imagined the energy of those emotions returning to me, not as destructive fury, but as vital strength and clarity. In parallel, I started practicing meditation, specifically focused on body awareness. I learned to pinpoint exactly where anger showed up in my body: the tightness in my throat, the heat in my chest, the tension in my jaw. Instead of trying to get rid of these sensations, I simply observed them with curiosity and compassion. "Hello, anger," I'd say silently. "I'm listening. What do you need to tell me today?" Gradually, a shift happened. The anger I'd always feared as a destructive force revealed itself as a protector. It was the part of me that refused to accept the unacceptable, that stood up when I was belittled, that roared when I was silenced. It said, "Enough with abandoning yourself. Enough with shrinking yourself. I'm here to protect you." It was a profound revelation. My anger wasn't my enemy, it was my guardian. The part of me that stayed wild and untamed when everything else was domesticated to please others. A recurring dream I'd had since I was a teenager finally changed. In the original dream, I was in a burning house, politely offering tea to the flames. In the new version, I was still in a burning house, but instead of smiling at the fire, I acknowledged it, thanked it for the warning, and then calmly walked out into the open air, into freedom. In my journal, I wrote, "Anger is the soul's fire alarm. I won't silence its sound anymore." The transformation wasn't just internal. As I started listening to and honoring my anger, my relationships shifted. Some people, used to my endless compliance, grew uncomfortable with my new boundaries. Some drifted away. Others, surprisingly, adapted, and our relationships grew deeper. I discovered that by honoring my anger, not as a destructive outburst, but as an authentic expression of my needs and boundaries, I was finally allowing relationships to be built on truth, not on a perpetual performance of keeping everyone happy. The biggest lesson was learning that my anger didn't need dramatic confrontations or shouting matches. It simply asked to be heard, validated, and honored as a valuable messenger of my inner truth. It didn't scream. It cried, and when I finally allowed myself to hear it, I realized its tears weren't of rage, but of relief for finally being acknowledged. The real test came on a Saturday afternoon at a cafe where I was meeting Sophia, a longtime friend. Our friendship had followed a predictable pattern. She talked, I listened, she decided, I agreed. She shone, I clapped from the audience. That day, I arrived right at 3 as planned, but Sophia, as always, was late. I took a seat by the window and ordered a cappuccino. While waiting, I mentally reviewed the work I'd been doing over the past few weeks. Daily meditation focused on tuning into my body, writing exercises to give voice to my repressed anger, and practices for setting healthy boundaries. When Sophia finally showed up 45 minutes later, there was no apology on her face. She just slid into the seat like she was right on time, tossed her purse on the empty chair, and immediately launched into a story about her new job. "You won't believe what happened at the office yesterday," she began without even asking how I was. "That new manager, Patricia, had the nerve to question my presentation in front of everyone. I was, and so it went for 20 uninterrupted minutes. I did my usual routine, smiling, nodding, tossing in the right wow, that's crazy, and you're so right at the right moments. Finally, I tried to talk about a new course I was really excited about, but Sophia glanced at her phone and barely looked up. In the middle of my sentence, she cut me off. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. I made dinner plans with Pedro tonight, so I'll have to leave in half an hour. You don't mind, right? You always understand these things." That was when I felt it. First in my stomach, that familiar knot. Then in my throat, a lump rising. Then in my chest, a heat spreading. My anger, my old companion, now recognized, was sending me a clear signal. Instead of automatically smiling and saying, "Sure, no problem," like I would have done 1,000 times before, I took a deep breath. I felt the air fill my lungs, creating space for what needed to be said. "Actually, Sophia," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "not today. We scheduled this coffee a week ago. You showed up almost an hour late without apologizing, And now you're cutting our time even shorter." My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Sophia looked at me with genuine surprise, like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What's gotten into you?" she asked with a nervous laugh. "You've never cared about that before." "Exactly," I replied, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I never showed it bothered me, but the truth is it always has. And today, I'm choosing to tell you. The silence that followed was heavy. I could see a rush of emotions flicker across Sophia's face: surprise, confusion, annoyance, and finally something like acknowledgement. "I had no idea," she said at last, setting her phone down. "You always seemed so okay with everything." "I know," I responded. "I spent a long time being okay with everything, even when I wasn't. But I'm learning to be more honest, with myself and with the people I care about." We ended up having the most authentic conversation we'd had in years. Sophia admitted she was so used to my infinite flexibility that she never thought about how her actions affected me. I explained that my new approach wasn't an attack on her, but a way to honor myself and, ultimately, our friendship. "I'd rather tell you when something bothers me than hold on to resentments that could destroy our relationship down the line," I said. By the time we said goodbye, 2 hours later, because Sophia cancelled her dinner plans with Pedro, I felt something extraordinary, a sense of lightness, not from avoiding conflict but from facing it honestly. My voice shook, but it was mine, and I heard my anger a smile. That moment in the cafe with Sophia was the first of many, small turning points in my daily life where, instead of swallowing my discomfort, I let myself feel it, honor it, and express it. With my mom, when she commented on my weight during a family lunch. With my boss when he tried to assign another project on top of an already impossible workload. With a man on a dating app when he insisted on meeting somewhere I'd already said I wasn't comfortable with. Every no I said, every boundary I set, every time I let my anger guide me instead of scare me, it was like working a muscle that had long been atrophied and was finally getting stronger. I realized boundaries aren't walls. They're maps showing people, myself included, where it's safe to step and where it isn't. Maps that don't shut people out, but guide them, creating relationships grounded in truth and respect. The anger I once feared as a destructive force turned out to be a compass. It pointed straight to the areas in my life that needed care, attention, and sometimes deep transformation. The first nights were the most surprising. After years of chronic insomnia, countless nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction of the day, wondering if I'd pleased enough, if I'd been understanding enough, if I'd kept the peace well enough, I began to sleep. Not fitful, interrupted sleep, but deep, restful sleep. Sleep without those recurring nightmares in which I tried to scream but nothing came out. Sleep without the constant teeth grinding that had worn down my tooth enamel over the years. "What changed in your bedtime routine?" my therapist asked, visibly surprised by the turnaround. "Nothing in my bedtime routine," I answered. "Something in me." The physical pains started to fade too. The chronic tension in my shoulders and neck that no massage could fully relieve. The headaches that showed up right after interactions where I'd shrunk myself to accommodate others. The stomach discomfort that followed family gatherings. Not that it all magically disappeared. There were days when the old pattern crept back in. Days when the good girl internal voice whispered that I was being selfish, difficult, problematic. Days when the fear of displeasing or causing conflict loomed larger than my commitment to honor my boundaries. On those days, I went back to the practices I'd established: body-centered meditation, writing and burning letters, talking to my reflection about the repressed parts of me. Over time, those days became less frequent, less intense. The biggest surprise was realizing that by letting myself feel anger, I was also unlocking my capacity to feel everything else more fully: joy, gratitude, love, serenity. A simple but revealing example. For years I ignored how my uncle's double entendre jokes at Sunday lunches bothered me. I'd sit at the table politely smiling, then suffer migraines the rest of the day. The Sunday after my conversation with Sophia, when my uncle made another inappropriate comment, I didn't just automatically smile. Instead, I looked him in the eye and said calmly, "That joke makes me uncomfortable, Uncle. I'd rather you not make remarks like that in front of me." Silence fell over the table. My mom's eyes went wide. My dad stared at his plate. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then my uncle cleared his throat, mumbled something that sounded like an apology, and the conversation shifted to another topic. That day, for the first time in years, I went home without a headache. I sat on the porch, watched the sunset, and found myself smiling. Not a polite social smile, but a real smile of relief and inner peace. Gradually, I understood. Anger isn't the opposite of peace. Often, it's the path to peace. Honoring my anger doesn't mean living in a constant state of fury or resentment. It means recognizing when something is wrong, expressing clear boundaries, and then, and only then, being able to move forward. My therapist noticed the change. "You seem lighter," she said one session a few weeks after the incident with my uncle. "It's strange," I replied. "I always thought letting my anger show would make me heavier, more bitter, but it's the opposite. It's like I've put down a weight I carried so long I forgot it was there." "That's because you're no longer fighting yourself," she said. "When we deny a part of who we are, we use up an enormous amount of energy on that internal battle, energy that you now have available to actually live your life." I started noticing other subtle shifts. My posture literally improved. Years of tension had slumped my shoulders, as if I were unconsciously trying to make myself smaller, less noticeable. Now I naturally stood straighter, taking up my rightful space. My voice changed too. The slightly hesitant, almost apologetic tone that used to define my speech became more firm, more grounded. Not louder or aggressive, just more present. "For you look different," a co-worker remarked. A co-worker I hadn't seen in a few months. "I can't put my finger on it, but you seem more you." I smiled at the comment, recognizing its truth. I was more me. Not because I'd turned into someone else, but because I'd finally stopped silencing parts of who I'd always been. Not because I'm calm, but because I've stopped running from myself. At night before bed, I started a new ritual. I'd place my hand over my heart and thank my anger, not as an external force, but as an integral part of me. I thanked it for its wisdom, its protection, and for persisting in making itself heard, even when I tried every way possible to silence it. "Thank you for not giving up on me," I'd whisper, "even when I gave up on you." Then I'd lay my head on the pillow and fall asleep, deeply and completely, knowing there was someone looking out for me. Me. Now, a year after that first conversation with Sophia at the cafe, I sit down to write this story. Not as some grand testament of total transformation. Integrating our shadows is a lifelong process, but as a marker on the path. Sunlight bathes my office in a golden glow as I reflect on how far I've come and how much I still have to learn. The journey of recognizing and honoring my anger hasn't made it my dominant emotion. Instead, it's let it take its rightful place in the full spectrum of my emotional experiences. There are still days when I struggle with old patterns, Moments when the automatic smile comes before I connect with what I'm really feeling. Situations where yes slips out when my whole body is screaming no. The difference is that now I notice, not as failures or regressions, but as opportunities for self-compassion and reconnection. Oh, there's that old pattern again, I say to myself when I see it creeping in. It's okay, you're learning. Next time, remember to check in with your inner truth first. One of the biggest lessons I've learned this year is that healthy anger isn't about explosions or destruction. It's not about shouting, breaking things, or hurting others with sharp words. Anger, in its purest and most functional form, is simply a messenger of truth, clear, firm, and above all dignified. Dignified anger, as I've started calling it, sets boundaries without burning bridges. It says no without demeaning the other person. It honors my truth without denying the humanity of whoever's in front of me. I've also realized that anger isn't a monster. It's a compass, a guardian, the cry that becomes a border. When my 7-year-old niece visited last week, I watched her playing in the yard. At one point, an older boy tried to take her toy. She frowned, planted her feet, and said firmly, "No, I'm using this right now. You can have it when I'm done." I felt tears well up as I witnessed that small demonstration of healthy boundaries. Part of me wondered what my life would have been like if, like her, I'd grown up knowing my anger wasn't something to be feared or suppressed, but a valuable ally in navigating the world. Later that night, when I tucked her in, she asked for a story. Instead of reading one of the children's books on the shelf, I shared a simplified version of my own journey. "Have you ever felt so much anger it scared you?" I began. She nodded seriously, her big eyes focused on mine. "I felt it too," I continued. "For years I was taught to smile, to swallow my screams, to stay light, even when the world weighed a ton on me." She snuggled closer, captivated. But one day it came, not as an enemy, but as a guardian. "What's a guardian?" she asked. "Someone who protects you," I explained. "Someone who makes sure nobody hurts you or makes you feel small." She thought for a moment, then smiled. "Like when you stood up to that boy at the park today, when he cut in front of you in line, and you told him that wasn't cool." I smiled back, touched that she had noticed. "Exactly like that. I didn't scream at him or act mean, but I also didn't let him push me around. Your anger protected you," she concluded, with that crystal-clear wisdom only children have. "Yes," I agreed, kissing her forehead. "It protected me. And your anger can protect you too if you learn to listen to it." She yawned, eyes closing. "Will you tell me more of that story tomorrow?" "I promise," I said, turning off the light. "Good night, and dream about the part of you that already knows how to stand up for itself." Watching her drift off to sleep, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing that all her emotions are valid and valuable. That her anger isn't something to fear or suppress, but a powerful ally for living authentically. That setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's a fundamental act of self-care and self-respect. And maybe, through my example and the stories I share, she won't have to wait decades to learn what took me so long to figure out. That anger, when honored and heard, doesn't make us worse people. It makes us more fully human, more deeply connected, more genuinely ourselves. Returning to my desk, I pick up the poem I started the night before. The words flow more freely now, without the constant filter I use to apply to every thought in hopes of external approval. Anger isn't a monster. It's a compass. It's a guardian. It's the cry that becomes a border. Good night, and dream of the part of you that already knows how to defend itself. I reread the lines, feeling them resonate in every cell of my body. This is the story I need to share, not as an instruction manual or magic formula, but as a testimony that it's possible to make peace with the parts of ourselves we fear most, that our shadows, when brought into the light of consciousness, don't devour us, they complete us, that our emotions, even the scariest ones, hold valuable wisdom and guidance, that our anger, when we treat it as a messenger rather than an intruder, can lead us toward a life of greater authenticity, integrity, and, ironically, peace. As night falls and the stars fill the sky, I feel a deep gratitude for this journey, with all its pains and revelations, for the therapist who helped me take the first steps, for Jung's books that lit the way, for the people in my life who have witnessed my transformation, some supporting, some challenging, each contributing in their own way. But most of all, I feel grateful to myself for persisting, for having the courage to look into the darkness within and not turn away, for choosing truth, even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable, for learning to trust my body's wisdom and the messages my emotions were sending, for finally realizing that anger didn't come to destroy me, but to rebuild me into someone more whole, more real, more alive. Now, whenever I feel that familiar warmth rising in my chest, that tightness in my throat, that urge to say no when something isn't right, I'm no longer afraid. I recognize it as the precious signal it is, my inner guardian speaking, my compass pointing, my truth emerging. The anger I once feared has become the ally I trust most. The emotion I was taught to hide has become the power I now proudly display. The part of me I thought I needed to tame turned out to be exactly what I needed to set myself free. This is a Jungian bedtime story about the anger that saved me, but it's also an awakening into a life lived not in denial of my deepest truths, but in their full, courageous expression. It's a story still being written day by day, choice by choice, every time I hear the call of my anger and respond, not with fear, but with reverence. I'm listening. I'm here. Thank you for protecting me. And then, finally at home in my own being, I sleep the sleep of the authentic, deep, restorative, free of nightmares. Not because I'm perfect or have mastered all my shadows, but because now I know the way back when I get lost, because I know integration, not repression, is the real path to inner peace, because now I have someone who protects me, myself,